Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's GTCS webinar, the first in our monthly Wellbeing Wednesday webinar series. Today's webinar is Feeling the Burn, Cultivating Self-Renewal Practices During Recovery, presented by Claire Lavelle, Managing Director of the Hive of Wellbeing, and Sharon Smith, Senior Education Officer at GTC Scotland. I'm Fraser Shand, and I work at GTCS as Digital Communications and Events Coordinator. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select phone call in the audio pane and dial-in information will be displayed. You can also use this pane to toggle between your device speakers and headphones should you have any difficulty with hearing the presentation. You can submit questions by typing these into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions, thoughts and reflections at any time during the presentation. Only the presenting team can see these comments, and if you prefer to remain anonymous, please let us know in this question text. You can also use the questions pane to raise any technical issues you have, and we will do the best we can to find a solution. Please note that the GoToWebinar system is hosted online and relies on our home internet connections, so please bear with us should we encounter any difficulties during the webinar tonight. Materials from tonight's webinar and a recording will be available on our Health and Wellbeing Hub, which you can find by Googling GTCS Health Wellbeing and in the MyPL Resources section. I'd now like to introduce Sharon Smith to introduce tonight's webinar.
Thank you, Fraser, and welcome everyone. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name's Sharon Smith and I'm a Senior Education Officer at the General Teaching Council for Scotland. I've been working alongside Claire Lavelle during lockdown to support teacher wellbeing. So we've moved to a slightly different phase of support, which we're calling, as you know, Wellbeing Wednesdays, and this is the first of these monthly webinars. Fraser later on in the session will share a link with you in the chat panel where you can access future Wellbeing Wednesday events, which will be on the last Wednesday of every month. I just really want to thank you all very much for joining us today. I wholeheartedly appreciate the efforts you have made to do so. We hope that you really feel the benefit of having some time and space to reflect on your own specific circumstances just now during this session. I want to make sure that you've grabbed a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, you've got a chocolate biscuit or something, whatever it is that works for you, and you've got a notepad and pen just ready to scribble down any notes that you feel will help you on your way. As Fraser said, we'll take questions throughout the hour, so please feel free to ask away. If we don't manage to answer your questions, Claire will respond later with any questions that are asked and we'll put something together on the website. So, welcome back, Claire. Lovely to have you join us again.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Fraser, thank you to you, Sharon, and thank you to GTCS for having me back again. I've done a series of sessions and I know that they are available as well on the GTCS website and on the YouTube channel as well. So today there's a kind of different perspective that I take, but hopefully in line with some of the themes that I've covered before. I want to say a massive thank you to all our colleagues today who are joining us today, an incredibly tough time in education. I want to start with a story of a teacher that I saw on Twitter just the other week. And I think it was maybe just last week, and she had struggled home. She'd walked for miles in the wind and the rain, carrying heavy bags of work to look at later that evening. And she'd taken a photograph as well of her home, her garden and her empty driveway. And then by the end of the tweet had informed us that she just remembered that she'd driven to work that day. And I think this kind of sums up where our colleagues, our teachers are just now, that in fact we're so focused on the needs of our class, of our children, of our families, to the detriment of our own needs, and that we've got a head full of work with very little space for anything else just now, and certainly how it is we're getting to work and how it is we're getting home and whatever else is happening at home. So today, as always in these sessions, I offer bags of empathy, I offer bags of compassion, as well as some ideas to support you in cultivating some self-renewal practices. There is one idea that I do want to put particular focus on today, and that is this idea of reappraising our thoughts and our beliefs to mediate our stress. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that we need to reappraise a belief that the virus won't come into our schools. I know that the virus has come into a number of our settings, and from what I'm hearing, it is incredible the response that staff are making to make sure everyone is kept as safe as is possible. I'm also not asking you to reappraise that others' behaviours at this time are acceptable when in fact they may be quite unethical and unjust. That's not what I'm about today. The external circumstances that we are finding ourselves in are what they are. But I'm asking us to consider if we can reduce the stress by examining our relationship with those external circumstances, and to consider a resourceful way in which we might wish to relate to our circumstances differently. And I've got other renewal practices that I will share with you today. I've got this lovely quote here from the lovely Calm app, which I use on a daily basis, and I know that a number of colleagues use this as well. But this idea of cultivating non-doing, I think we're very concerned just now that if we stop, then things around us might collapse and come around about our ears. But in fact, in cultivating a practice of non-doing, where we are intentionally saying, this is my time to stop and to take some cognizance of what's going on, then in fact, that can pay dividends for our well-being. And I hope that this next hour that we have together allows you to have a bit of non-doing, maybe a bit of thinking and reflection, but at least a space to gather our thoughts. So, moving forward with some of our themes and objectives today. I don't usually express concern in my sessions. I try to keep things upbeat, and I try to keep things as positive as I possibly can. But I do want to acknowledge that I think colleagues are facing, are severely challenged at this particular time. And I want to take cognizance of that. And I also want to acknowledge that colleagues have been working above and beyond the call of duty since Christmas. Christmas holiday of last year is the last holiday that our educators have had, quite realistically, because even in the summer, the holiday was restricted by us not being able to go perhaps very far. And indeed for our leaders, there's been no let up in this at all. So my concern today is how sustainable it is to keep up this level of stress. Now, we all know that there is a certain level of performance stress which can be healthy for us, but not at such a prolonged way, and not in a way that becomes so detrimental to our well-being. I've used a gym metaphor today, this idea of feeling the burn. You know, they say, oh, you feel the burn, you feel the benefit. And there's also this other saying that comes to mind, you know, no pain, no gain. And sure, there is some leverage in this idea of stretching ourselves and setting ourselves stretch goals. However, in schools just now and in early year settings, those stretch goals are not goals that we are choosing for ourselves. And looking at the research on burnout, when I don't have autonomy and control over what it is I'm choosing to do and what I can do, and if I have a lower sense of self-efficacy and that I come in every day and that what I'm doing, I don't feel I'm making much of a difference, then very quickly, all the efforts I'm being asked to make, not through my own choosing, can lead to a place of burnout, which we want to avoid as much as possible. So one of my questions I suppose I want to ask us today as we go through this is that when can we safely step off the treadmill, which seems to be on constant at the moment and increasing in our speed? So in sessions and conversations with colleagues, I've been hearing there's a real tension just now. There's a tension just now between what is recovery and what is business as usual. And I appreciate that we've come back into this term believing that we are in a time of recovery, but I also understand that there's a real desperate sense for us to hang on to a sense of normality, and where we want to get back to a place of how things maybe were before. There's a question though, how were things before and how healthy was that? But of course, we know things are not as they were before. There are new features in our schools that demonstrate we are not in normal times. So there are no parents or visitors coming into our schools. There is the wearing of masks in corridors, particularly so in our secondary schools. And there are also staggered lunches. And from what I'm hearing, you know, what used to be 11s for pupils is now their lunch. And some of them are having a rather late lunch at 2:30 before they're bundled onto a bus. So I do appreciate these new features do make a difference to our normal sense of school. And I do understand the desire for us to be back to business as usual. There's a need psychologically perhaps for that. But I'm also concerned about us rushing back to how things were, and us rushing back to the stresses that we have experienced from before, on top of the stresses of coming back into school. Colleagues just last week were saying to me that although they were excited and enthusiastic coming back to school, as were the children, they are now starting to see that perhaps some of the impact of lockdown on their children is starting to come to the surface in terms of the psychological needs for our children. So in this slide, I've got some of these clouds, these thought clouds, that are perhaps different for us just now. But I'm also conscious of this idea of the need to stay grounded and to cultivate a sense of calm. Emma Sapala, in her book, The Happiness Track, talks in one of her chapters about cultivating calm. And she talks about the use of our breath. And she talks about the fact that US Marines are trained to breathe deeply so that when they find themselves in a combative situation, they breathe in a way that allows them to come down from the stress response, the fight or flight response, into their bodies to a place of the rest and digest response, which is our normal response for us to feel good. I'm going to ask us to do this just now. I'm going to ask us to breathe together, and I hope everyone is okay with this. It's a very strange thing to do in a webinar. But what I would ask you to do, if this helps as well, is to take your hands and to focus on your hands and to focus on taking a deep breath at the same rate at which you do that, to allow your hands to move in the same way. I'm going to ask you to take 5 deep breaths just now, please. So if we start by breathing in, breathing out, and breathing in. Thank you so much for engaging in that with me just now. Sometimes having our hands there can allow us just an extra focus. So we watch our breath. It takes us away sometimes if we feel anxious about taking those deep breaths. But I hope that those deep breaths are a reminder to us and a help to us to bring us back to some semblance of rest and digest just now, and take us out of our heads a bit more than perhaps we have been today, as we've had such a busy day. I would also ask you to maybe set a timer for yourself, and do this now. Set a timer for a time for tomorrow in the morning to do this, to remember to breathe, and to set a timer for yourself for the afternoon to remind yourself to breathe. And if you're in class, why not do it with your class? But just bring yourself that opportunity to cultivate that calm. We're not always able in the middle of a class to take a walk or to remind ourselves of those mindful moments, but perhaps we can take those deep breaths. And also just a little reminder in the corner here about the future. We've never known the future. We've never known what lies ahead. And in a journey towards the future, maybe it's enough to know the next few steps, and not knowing the whole picture can be difficult for us at a time of uncertainty. And indeed, we face greater uncertainty as we come into the winter. But also to remind ourselves, we're not here to fix it all for everybody. We are here to add value every single day to the lives of our children and our families and our colleagues. We're not here to fix it for everyone. So again, starting to consider our reappraisals of what we are here to do and how we can work together as we move towards the future. I also want to acknowledge a term that's not often spoken about in our schools, and that is a term called suffering. It's not something we kind of talk about, because I think in schools what we do all the time, because we feel that that's part of our responsibility in a caring role as well as an educator's role, we try to do everything that we possibly can so that we avoid the suffering. We avoid suffering for our pupils, make sure they feel better. For our colleagues, we always try to make it better. But I do wonder if that's part of our issue in our schools, that in fact we can't always take the suffering away. And if we try to make everything okay and painless and without that suffering, what might this create? Back to this idea of no pain, no gain. Well, even in any learning that we do with our young people and our children, it involves a certain amount of endurance, a certain amount of pain of sorts, if you like, of stretching, of pushing ourselves a little bit more. When our children and our young people are finding learning hard and finding adjustment to the new situation hard, we offer compassion all of the time. And compassion consists of 3 elements. The first element is a cognitive element where we understand each other. So I understand you when you're struggling with something. I also feel for you. I can have empathy with you and feel for you in your situation. And the third part of that element of compassion is a motivational part. I want to try and help you. I want to try and support you in the best way I can. Doesn't always mean I can fix it though, just to remind ourselves of this. But similarly, at this time, we may be finding this really challenging, this situation hard. And in fact, if we deny that there's some suffering just now or that we're struggling with this, we'd perhaps, in our resistance, cause ourselves to have a bit more of the suffering than we need to have. So in their work, Warleen and Dutton, over the last 30 years, they've been looking at this idea, this construct of compassion at work and in the workplace from a social science perspective. They've got 4 elements on this left-hand side here to awaken compassion: noticing, acknowledging that it is present just now. I think that's really helpful. We are in this together, and at times we are feeling it all in a tough way together. And then making meaning of the suffering. What is this to us? What does this mean to us? And how can we make those changes? Also feeling that concern for each other just now. But lastly, and really importantly, I think, is taking action to alleviate the suffering in some manner. Just as an example, in speaking to a school just last week, I was speaking to the whole staff team. They were all at home, working from home with the webinar that I had with them. But they were talking about the fact that they were really struggling and suffering as a result of not being able to come together as a team. And we spoke about this idea of how they could come together. This is a school that I have been into on numerous occasions, and it is a staff team in the staff room, and you hear the staff room before you see it because of the banter and the laughter and the fun and the jokes and the time that they have together. So in them not having that, and them being in bubbles and feeling quite separate, they were starting to lose that sense of who they were. So we talked about how they could have times together in staff meetings that are not just purely operational, but are actually checking in times and sharing that load and making meaning together of what's happening to us. And of course, on this right-hand side, the 3 aspects that close compassion down. We're hearing stories in the media just now about blaming our young people for spreading the virus and blaming students for spreading the virus. It's not helpful for our narrative just now. We need to be supportive of each other, be compassionate towards one another. Also believing that because we're all experiencing this together, we're all deserving of each other's concern, and that perhaps, and it's counterintuitive, but by sharing with others, then we do have the resources more so to care about one another. So moving forward, I'm afraid I don't have that silver bullet answer to well-being for everyone today in our present circumstances. I so wish I did. I so wish I had the answer book for this. But what I am aware of are the possible sources of stress and distress just now, just the ever-changing national and local picture, and the local lockdowns that are happening in different areas in our country just now. And that makes me very aware of what used to mediate the stress for us before is not in place now for us to mediate that together. So going for a coffee with a group of staff members after school, going round to visit friends, it's just not possible in different authorities at this particular time. So what do we have in order to mediate that stress? Also being asked to do just now things that are completely out of alignment with our sense of purpose and our daily reality. Very challenging at this particular time. So it made me think about how can we simplify some of this and how can we frame it in a way that perhaps support our way of bringing some of these thoughts, ideas together that are impacting on our levels of stress and on our feelings just now. And he thought about just these 3 aspects, how can we change the external circumstances that we face just now, which are very restrictive and restricting? How can we change the internal experiences that we're having? And there are certain situations we can't change. So how can we embrace the feelings that go with that? And an example of that is just what I've described just now with the idea of compassion at work. So let us turn to changing the external circumstances just now. What are the possibilities? As I said at the start, I'm here to provide as much empathy, compassion, and support as I can. So in speaking to schools and in individual conversations I've had with colleagues in these past number of weeks, Here are the challenges that I see are facing people on this left-hand side. As I said earlier, the virus at the door or indeed across the threshold. But also I'm hearing about how staff having plans in place are dealing with this so effectively and so well. And when those risk assessments are put to the test, they're standing up. And long may that continue. And I know that the First Minister is looking at a situation, and I know that our unions are looking at this ongoing situation as well. What I'm also aware of, though, is the interactions we're having with one another are tending to be vastly operational just now. And it's also struck me in the conversations that I've had with people how lacking in quality some of those interactions are at the moment. Also the sense of Groundhog Day for members of staff, where they feel we're so caught up with the routines, so caught up with the stagger break. It is grinding people down, just being on that kind of Groundhog Day, where in terms of what we are achieving as educators just now is lower and far less than we would expect to be achieving at this time of the year in comparison to how things might have been in a previous session in a previous term. I'm also hearing as well about the anxiety crossing our family thresholds too, and this idea of the workload of coming home every day, putting our clothes in the washing machines and going for showers. You know, this is taking up a huge chunk of time as we're coming home. And I'm also aware as well of the kind of external accountability, where we're finding that SQA, perhaps still there's the lack of clarity on our practical subjects, on what is demanded of us, and also regarding parental expectations and the accountability of them, a lot of those external pressures. I don't have answers, but I have thought of some possibilities in terms of how we frame that. So in terms of our use of time, thinking about the daily routine and changing it up of a week to support ourselves, because our brain loves nothing more than novelty and doing things a bit different in order to give us a sense of relief from the Groundhog Day effect. And within your timetable as well, changing some of the things that you're doing. And also within that, letting go of the attachment to some of the outcomes when you need to. So although you might have plans for the week and plans for the lessons, knowing that some children, some young people are just not going to be able to cope with what it is you're asking them to do. So being mindful of your own sense of control and letting go of some of those outcomes when things in fact need to attend to well-being issues rather than some of the learning, because we are in recovery. I've spoken at length about boundaries before. I don't want to speak at length again on this, but really thinking about your boundaries in terms of cut-off times, when you're going in the morning and when you're coming out of a day, and boundaries in terms of your accessibility of your evening, the accessibility to work, and that of your family time and your downtime. Also, chunking times, thinking about realistic goals. We might have looked at in the past at forward plans, which we thought were for the term, but in fact, realistically, it's maybe looking at things in 2-week sprints to see what we can get done to give us a sense of achievement as well. And also recognising we might have had a holiday booked for October. Indeed, we might have had a holiday booked at Christmas or indeed into spring of next year. We might be rethinking that, and therefore that does have an impact on our well-being of things to look forward to. And we are having to pull back from that. So making a bigger deal of the smaller events to look forward to, the restaurant trips out, people can still go to pubs, coffee shops, or away days. I'm seeing a lot of people up a lot in Munros just now, which is great. And that brings me to the use of space, being outdoors more and thinking about our physical environment, changing our physical environment for ourselves, whether it's at home. I know it's limited in the class because of cleanliness, surfaces, what we can change, but this might be the time to really up the game with wall displays that please you. I was never one for wall displays, I do to my shame, as many head teacher pointed out to me, but maybe this is the time to change the environment that is accessible to us, to change our perspective and to change how we feel about things.
Also, do you know, can I just come in there?
Yes,
because I think the use of space, if we think back to when we were in lockdown and we were teaching from home, families, it was you know, everywhere you could see that people were really appreciating outdoors and nature and very aware of how calming an influence that had on people, and it's something we shouldn't forget. But also it's a refreshing reminder that the seasons change, so this will also change, and we'll move into a new world going forward, just as the
Yeah.
seasons are changing. So, you know, it's all relative in that sense, that it's nice to be able to embrace nature, be outdoors, but appreciate that actually there's a very poignant message with that too.
Yeah, that's a lovely. Thank you very much. That's a lovely idea. I love that. Things will pass, and it's something I refer to later on in the session. So yeah, thank you very much. Also, this idea, and I've touched on about teams being together but apart. The interesting paper from a professor, Stephen Reicher, from St Andrews University. He's written a paper with colleagues about the COVID-19 and the impact, and you can download this. It's free. So Professor Stephen Reicher, Together Apart is the paper, talking about the need for us to socially connect whilst physically apart, because it is absolutely imperative for our well-being at this time. And also, I've just thought about this idea as we do come into the autumn and into the winter, Sharon, thinking about this idea of the Danish concept of hygge, and embracing the winter, and this idea of what are the hobbies, what are the, you know, what is it that allows us to feel cosy, to feel safe, because we need the self-soothing at a time when we're feeling highly stressed. So how do I change my home environment or my home routine to increase that level of self-soothing in that respect? So moving now from those kind of external ideas, and those are just some, and I know I've only got an hour and I'd love to go into much more depth with a lot of this. I know I've thrown out a lot of ideas in a very short space of time. But
Claire, before you go on to the slides,
Yeah,
could we just maybe
sure.
have a look at the questions? So,
Certainly, sorry.
not very many, so please, folks, if you have questions for Claire, please write them in the question pane. But Alison has said that this is a really difficult time to keep the camaraderie and positive ethos going with staff at the moment. All the focus is on being safe and meeting the needs of our learners, so this is really a really helpful message, Claire, so thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Alison.
And Sharon has asked if you could please repeat the professor's name that
Yeah.
wrote the paper for Together Apart.
Yeah, so it's Stephen, as PH, Reich, I think it's either Reicher or Reicher, Reicher, and he's a behavioural psychologist at the University of St Andrews. He's speaking quite a lot in the media just now. I saw him on Channel 4, and he had a webinar last week at St Andrews. So, and I think that is possible to access. Really interesting chat.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much, people sending questions and ideas. So changing our inner landscape just now. So again, left-hand list, you know, the things that I know are really difficult for people just now. One of the things, again, I keep hearing is about, are we in recovery or is it business as usual? I do wonder if there are conflicting messages just now, and it's not my place to make a judgment on that. And I suppose I would really ask the question, is business as usual supporting our well-being, or is it causing us greater stress? And I think that's a fine line, because again, as I said before, it's about reaching that sense of what feels normal. This feels normal to come to work, and that's a good thing for me. But for others, it may be a sense of, whoa, hang on, this is recovery time. And if I'm being asked to provide a lot about, say, attainment or achievement, we're not there yet. You know, I was listening to a school a couple of weeks ago, and they were saying to me, look, Claire, we're feeling that where we are now in the school year is so far behind where we would normally be. And we all understand why. But are we giving ourselves a break and some leeway in facing these different circumstances? So that also ties into this idea of our own expectations as educators and the beliefs that support us, or indeed the beliefs that are perhaps not supportive. I'm also appreciative that it is a roller coaster of emotions. We've spoken about this before in previous sessions, but the idea of John Fisher's personal transition curve, you know, it's a roller coaster of emotions, and it's not just day to day, it can be hour to hour in terms of the pressing demands. So recognising where those emotions are coming from, what are the thoughts that preceded that, and also what are our drivers? Are we driven predominantly by fear and anxiety just now, or is it from a place of passion? Just keeping that in mind. I talked as well about anxiety taking the virus home, extra workloads, washing clothes, going for extra showers. But I think there's also the guilt that people have been speaking to me about having to self-isolate. If we have the mentality that my well-being is wrapped up in your well-being and your well-being is wrapped up in mine, there is no place for guilt. We are all in this together. And I just want to ask our schools, our settings, our leaders, our managers as well to keep reiterating that message. I've been speaking to loads of leaders in recent weeks who've been saying, I want my staff to feel safe. I just want them to be as safe as possible. We're all in it together. And also anger and frustration. I know that's coming through quite a bit as well. So what are our possibilities to mediate stress and to support here? Right, so I'm going to say something that people will think, oh, very good, Claire. Aye, very good. We've not heard this before. But I really do want to emphasise this idea of less is more. And let me put it in a bit of a real perspective. When COVID-19 hit our hospitals, the NHS shut down almost every other service and said, we are dealing with COVID. Now, we're talking about life and death situations. It was that serious. In the same vein as frontline workers who I'm speaking to today, we also need to be very clear as to what is core to our workload just now in a time of recovery. And therefore, if we have been finding that we're getting into business as usual and we're on the same kind of roller coaster that we would be at any start of the term, we need to take a step back. And I know I'm being quite passionate about this, but I do think that if we don't take a step back now, today, after this webinar tonight, then we could end up allowing something to gather momentum that is not helpful to us just now, and gathering up more tasks that are not conducive to our well-being.
Claire,
because we're spread. Sorry.
I beg your pardon. Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
Less is more is absolutely spot on, but it's extremely counterintuitive for teachers. We're so used to doing so much and multitasking all the time. How do we do that?
I know. Well, it's really challenging. You're asking really challenging questions today, Sharon. It's great. I think a lot of it is to do with our sense of caring. We're carers. We care all the time. And I'm going to come on to that in the following slides. But we're also caught up with the habitual appraisals that we make of our situations. If we take the NHS example, many people felt very let down that they couldn't access services, but it was as it was. And sometimes we think we have to not disappoint people or not cause more suffering. Whereas in fact, we have to, I think, be quite, I'm going to use this word brutal. I think we do have to be quite brutal about what we can do and what we cannot do as a collective in a school. Because this virus is brutalising. And it's brutalised the way that we live our lives just now. It's so restrictive for us just now. Therefore, I think we do have to be very clear and very brutal about what it is at our core work just now and what is not. And it may mean that we disappoint people. It may be, as we look at the right-hand side here just now, we have to appraise situations differently, and we have to look at our purpose and self-efficacy in a different way. And also keeping ourselves grounded with this and knowing it's the right thing to do. I'm taken back to my SQH days and Fullan and Hargreaves, where they talked about, what's worth fighting for in our schools. They talk about the moral purpose. So what's our moral purpose just now? Surely it's everyone's well-being, including our own. I'm being very contentious today, Sharon. I hope the GTCS have me back. I'm going to take us to another gym analogy just now. We talk about, feeling the burn, but for those of us who've perhaps been to the odd yoga class, and when I say odd yoga class, I felt very odd at them. I'm not sure I'm a natural yoga person, but at the yoga classes or Pilates, they talk about you build up your core. And I think this is a very helpful gym analogy to use just now. It's not about the burn, but it's about building the core, and again feeds into that idea of the moral imperative for us just now. So our values, our beliefs, our mission and purpose, they may all have to be reviewed and to be changed at this time. I think our sense of mission has changed in terms of what we can do in schools. And if it's recovery, even our Scottish Government have given out guidelines on values such as safe, ethical, realistic, and they've talked about trade-offs regarding us enacting those values and those principles. So it may be that we look at our core, look at what matters to us, and want to look at that today and consider what is our why and what is my why as an individual just now. Mindset, we've been teaching in these last 10 years the Carol Dweck idea of mindset, the growth or the fixed mindset. But where is our mindset just now? How do we feel that we are growing from this? And what are the opportunities for us to develop our growth in situations that are incredibly tough right now? And again, boundaries. involving sleep, nutrition, exercise. It is the whole oxygen mask idea. You know, we're no good to others without these basic boundaries in place for what we need at our core to keep us as healthy as possible. Perspective, being team, these are also aspects we want to look at. But I also want to share another gym saying that was shouted in my ear circa 2005 when I decided that it was time to access the services of a personal trainer, Barry. And as I was fit on a, what are they called? Cross trainers. On one of these cross trainers. Oh yeah, I've done it all in a gym. Yoga, cross trainers, I'm the one. I was on this cross trainer, and towards the end of the session, as he was upping the levels of the cross trainer, and I was simply dying, he kept saying, "Have you had enough yet? Have you had enough yet?" And I could barely breathe. And then he said in my ear, and he's obviously been reading some of these mantras in these personal trainer books, very helpful. "Strong is what happens when you run out of wheat, Claire. Strong is what happens when you run out of wheat." Who knew that I would be quoting Barry 15 years later in a GTCS webinar? But the reason I quote this is that there are times when we've just had enough, that actually our core kicks in, that we actually get to a place of going, nah, I can't do all of this. It's just not possible. That is not a bad place to be. That is actually quite a productive place to be if we get into a place of recognising, right, what is possible and what can I take from this? Because sometimes when we're at our weakest, it is just the point before our strongest moments. So considering what is at our core as an educator now, an identity as an educator, that programme on BBC, Who Do You Think You Are? The BBC programme, you know, looking at our family trees, seeing the patterns in our ancestors and what they did before us. And of course, I'm not asking us to do that today. This is not a history lesson. But I think there is value in going back sometimes to that core of who we are as educators, looking at our experiences and look at the experiences that really formed us, and realising that our sense of self-efficacy now, so our beliefs in our capability and our competence now, are affected by those past experiences. They're also affected by our sense of self-esteem, levels of self-esteem, and our energy levels. When our energy feels good, we can take on the world and things feel great. And that's when my nutrition, my sleep, my exercise, my balance is better. I feel good once I've rested. My self-esteem, my self-efficacy is affected when my energy is low. My self-efficacy is also affected when my self-esteem can feel a bit lower. And my self-esteem, and this is taken from research, and again, I'll put the references for all of this into a slide for sending on to you tomorrow, Sharon. But looking at the research, self-esteem is earned as an educator through our participation in these three roles. Educator as a facilitator of pupil learning, educator as a participant of planning procedures policies, and as a developing professional. And therefore, I think this is key to understanding what we might be feeling right now. If I'm not able to truly facilitate pupil learning in the way I would wish to do, my self-esteem might be quite unconsciously affected by this just now. If I feel frustrated because I have no say over what's happening to me in the policies and procedures that are taking place just now, again, it does affect my sense of autonomy, my sense of self-esteem. And as a developing professional, if everything is just about the operational just now, how can I get an opportunity to lift my head and to look at aspects of my professional development that I'm really excited about and yet have been put on hold? They talk in the research that self-esteem also requires that self-acceptance, and that's a very difficult place to get to when we've got such high expectations of ourselves as educators. And believe me, I share those high expectations and always have. And I myself have had to look at those core beliefs and reappraise some of the cognitions I've made about what I think about myself and about my work, and how realistic my appraisals are of my expectations. So, for example, in the past, I have felt 100% responsible for everything that happens in my classroom or has happened in my school. That's not realistic. I can't control certain behaviours that take place in my classroom, certain mood states that some pupils will be in, or indeed what happens in the school as well. But I also have to not get into that all or nothing thinking and thinking, well, what's the point? I never make a difference no matter what I do. It's trying to find that balance, which still allows me to strive and still allows me to aim for those high expectations, but is also realistic in terms of the resources that I have for me to achieve them. So this brings me to a slide that I've used a number of times, and I just want to revisit this just momentarily. But these perceptions and beliefs that we have currently of workload, student behaviour and school leadership, if they are negative, and again from the research I've looked at, we can get into a place of reducing our sense of autonomy and reducing our self-efficacy, which leads to an emotional exhaustion, depersonalisation, which can take us to a place of switching off, numbing, and a real sense of cynicism that isn't always helpful, and also reduces our sense of minimising, it minimises what it is we do, reduces our sense of accomplishment, which can in time lead to this burnout. And I'm concerned about this. So as a way of trying to support this today in this one way, I would like to talk about how we can reappraise and focus on those core beliefs that may support us at this particular time. Suspending our limiting beliefs. I'd ask us to take a time to suspend our limiting beliefs. We all have beliefs about our work, about who we are as an educator, about who we are in relation to others, whether it's our children, our young people, or whether it's colleagues, whether it's line managers. We also have beliefs about the world, about life conditions and the current situation. And we have supportive beliefs about those three main areas, as exemplified in the left-hand side of the table. But we also have limiting beliefs that are ours and that are things that we can change. And the reason I know that this can change, if we look at the work of cognitive behaviour therapists, at the core of their work in trying to support people with really good mental health, and mental health for me is on this continuum of really good mental health to not so good mental health. They talk about this idea of addressing those core beliefs and looking at what is core to what we think about the world, ourselves and others. So this is why I suppose I have become a coach, and I'm passionate about coaching, because I think that in a coaching conversation or in a counselling session or in a critical friend conversation or in a really good constructive chat with a colleague, we've got a chance to really review our beliefs. Because in teaching, in education, we have resources, so what I've got in my tank and what I can provide, what I can offer as an individual, but we've also got the demands. And sometimes those demands outweigh the resources that we've got left to offer. As Hochschild said about the service industries in 1983, teaching is an emotional labour. We are not just educators, we are carers. And as Van Silke Briggs talked about in her book, Nurturing Suffering, there's that word again, suffering, there's an invisible form of stress that comes from our ties as educators with our pupils, and there's a blurred role as a teacher takes on a carer role. I'm concerned just now that that blurred role is heightened more than ever, and if we don't recognise that that is also an added pressure to us or an added stress during this time of recovery, then how will we be able to at least address it if we don't bring it into the light and make it more conscious for ourselves? So the key mediator in the research that I've looked at regarding burnout and regarding how we pick ourselves up and boost ourselves, there are many mediators, but one of the really key ones I wanted to focus on today is our appraisals and how we judge what we see before us. Now, when we make an appraisal of a situation, we do it instantaneously, unconsciously, and it's based on our experiences, our perceived needs, and also levels of anxiety. So if we perceive a challenging situation in our classroom or in our setting, we can just go to a place of, nah, I can't cope with this, or that's too much, or they're getting all this wrong. But it doesn't always enable us to really look at the core of where we have made those appraisals from and how resourceful those places are and those core beliefs are to enable us to make good appraisals which support us and will reduce this impact of stress. Reappraisals need to be made more slowly and more consciously. And as I've been saying in previous sessions quite recently, if we don't slow down, if we don't engage the less is more idea to reappraise, we actually may be doing ourselves more damage emotionally and energetically. When I've been listening to conversations with staff, I'm hearing about trust breaking down, I'm hearing about relationships breaking down, when in fact, everything's about the operational, and that because I'm not always with certain members of staff, I'm starting to not trust them as much as I normally would if I would be having more contact with them, which just isn't possible just now, and also sustaining those energy levels. So
Claire,
from a book, oh sorry,
Claire,
please
sorry,
come in.
can I interrupt there? So at the bottom of that previous slide, we talked about the reappraisals, but if they don't fit with the expectations of our school, what do we do? Now, we've had a few questions along that same strain, so that's why I'm coming in here. Rather than answer these questions individually or raise them individually, if it's just not fitting with the expectations of our school, how do we challenge that?
I know that this is very, very difficult just now, but we're also in a time, and I suppose I'm going to be quite contentious here. We are living in a time in education where we keep hearing about empowerment. And therefore, what is it to be empowered? If I am to be empowered as an individual within my setting, there has to be a safe space for me to express how I'm feeling about a situation without judgment and without any prejudice against where people might think I might be coming from. It's back to that whole idea of compassion and acknowledging that this is taking place and making meaning of that. So I agree that there aren't always the settings or the spaces where this can happen. But I think that this is the most challenging time that we've ever faced. And there are big questions that we're having to ask of ourselves just now and ask of one another. Whether we're a line manager or whether we are a teacher, an early years educator just now, we do have to acknowledge and we have to express what our needs are at this particular time. Now, what might that take? It might take a very challenging conversation that we've got to have with a manager, with a member of staff. But I think questions have to be asked. But again, I go back to this idea of it can only be that safe space if we are coming from the collective space of compassion for all, and we're all in this together. And leave our prejudgments behind as to how we might have related to one another before and come from that place of compassion. Now, I also appreciate that for some of us, that's going to be a step too far. And we may have to consider what our options are. I mean, I'm just putting things out there. I know in quite a contentious way. I do appreciate, but I think we have to ask ourselves these questions. I also think as well, there are also opportunities within a CAT calendar or a CLPL time, not to have people like me in. Oh, goodness me, people will be raging me saying this, people in my profession, but to really come together to talk about what it is to be together. And I know it'll have to be virtual just now, but just to start with the topic of what does compassion, if compassion is one of our values in a school, and I see it in schools all the time, or kindness is a value in our school, or collaboration is a value in our school, how can we enact it now by starting to listen to each other in a way that is real and meaningful and is uncomfortable at times because emotions are, but it's still safe to express that just now. So yeah, I hope that goes some way.
Thank you.
And again, if anyone's got anything they want to talk to me about personally, as ever, there's a half an hour with me for free. Pick up the phone, talk, chat to me, talk through what you need to talk through, and I will gladly help following this session. No problem at all.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Just wanted to refer you to this, not because it has lots of answers, but to just acknowledge that it exists, that there are books out there, there is literature out there that is talking about this kind of idea and this kind of way forward in talking about staff wellbeing. So there's a book called Cultivating Teacher Renewal by Barbara Larravie. Again, some of these will come up later in the slides, and I will put all the references to you for tomorrow, Sharon, and for people listening in just now. But she talks about the burnout cycle. Now, this is her example. And I'm not saying it's a typical example. I think we've moved on since 2009 about the anger, but we might have anger that we feel internally sometimes as to how children behave. But you might want to, instead of putting pupil misbehaves here, you might want to put down a parent complains, or we had an attainment meeting, whatever it is. But she talks about the cycle of how we appraise a situation, then goes on to magnify and reinforce the feelings that we have already, and how that can lead to further behaviours and situations that we don't wish for and can eventually lead to that sense of burnout. She then talks about the renewal cycle. She talks about that same situation, and she talks about taking a different appraisal to that and how we can do things differently, and also how it can support our sense of self-efficacy and how we can remain engaged. Her book goes into far more detail, but I just wanted to flash up a couple of the flow diagrams because I wanted to take us to this, and these are my insertions, where I've taken those flow diagrams and I've thought about this idea of where can we make those appraisals and where are they possible. And it made me think about this idea of the choices that we have regardless of where we are in the interaction, that in fact we can make choices and we can pull back and we can do things differently. And sometimes those reappraisals might not happen till after the incident happens. Sometimes we just got to let that incident go if it's not gone the way we hoped it would and it's not supported us. But the key to it, I think, is stopping and saying, right, well, how can I do it differently? And not going to a place of continually reliving the negative emotions that we experienced during that particular time. So how, Claire? It's all very well you saying that's what we do. How on earth can we do this? Thanks for asking, Sharon. Good. And I think it's this. I know this is a busy slide, but please bear with me. I'm trying to join up the thinking throughout this entire presentation, I suppose, in this kind of slide. And this idea of that situations happen. We have thoughts and feelings in response to those situations, and then we take action. But when we have those thoughts, some therapists, some coaches talk about those thoughts as being hot thoughts. And the hot thoughts, and here's where sometimes we do feel the burn, those hot thoughts are automatic thoughts that are just continually and unconsciously replayed in our minds and lead us to acting and feeling and behaving in ways that aren't always as resourceful for us as we would like. And we have biases, and I think that's why some people are concerned that if I go to my line manager and say things aren't great, we expect the response that we've always had because we know how people have responded before, and it just reinforces our sense of bias. But what if we were to do it differently? What if we were to approach it differently? And this is something that I know has worked with clients I've worked with before, where they've been stuck in a relationship with a line manager or with a colleague. And in fact, in knowing how to respond to things differently, it has shifted the relationship quite remarkably. So there's power in this and looking at things differently. So if I'm going to take us an example here. So here is James, and James is his real name. And this is Tamara, and Tamara, it is her real name. And the reason I can tell you that for sure is it's from Microsoft Office stock images. They have lots of images of James and Tamara doing different poses. Anyway, James here has been working in the hub through lockdown, has been going above and beyond and helping everybody in his school. That's just what he does. He's a team player, goes above and beyond. Tamara is a team player, absolutely, but poor Tamara, underlying health issue and had to shield right through lockdown. And since she's come back in August, she's been rather anxious about the whole situation, but is following the rules and regulations in order to be team and to support everyone. James one day during Tamara's rict time, gets a message to her to say, can you please come and take my class? But Tamara's been told you cannot go into each other's classrooms. That's not possible any longer. So Tamara, unfortunately, has to say to James and gets a message back to him to say, I'm sorry, James, just can't come in. So James goes to his hot thought, which is, nobody ever helps me. This is always the way. I go above and beyond, and nobody's there to support me when I need support. I'm supporting everyone else. And somehow manages to relay that to Tamara, who then goes to her hot thought of, we see, that's just, I'm useless. I can't support the team. I couldn't do it in lockdown and I can't do it now. So those hot thoughts can lead to these irrational beliefs that we have about our situation, which are continued. So my belief is that we need to start becoming conscious of these, and in doing so, do something that's practical. Now, I've put here, keep a journal. I know this is where a lot of people are just going to leave the webinar and go, keep a journal, very good, Lavelle. However, I want to put it in a context. I'm not asking people to be Samuel Pepys or to be, Bridget Jones. This is not this kind of journal or diary. All I'm asking you to do is to take a note or to write down or to find a friend, a critical friend to chat to about what hot thoughts you keep having, where things keep coming up, what you keep coming back to identify those patterns. You might even want to do it with your class, to do it with your young people, to talk about this idea of what are the hot thoughts, what are the anxiety-ridden thoughts that are coming up for them time and time again, or the angry thoughts that are coming up for them. And what might it really relate to? What might it be really coming from? So just get into a place of identifying that. And here's our structure, because I don't like to leave you without a tool to use. And the structure here is about, just keeping it conscious. Unashamedly, I've borrowed this from a CBT approach, but maybe this is helpful for some people to write down the situation, to consider that feeling and emotion, the hot thoughts that are coming up, and to evidence those hot thoughts, but also to come up with the evidence that's not supporting the hot thought. And here's where it changes. The alternative thoughts that may support you, really going there and thinking about how might that feel, and how is it now making me feel to think there might be an alternative thought or way to process this. And it could be around the conversation you need to have with that particular colleague, line manager, parent, whoever it is. Nice quote there from André Gide, the French writer. It's about making things conscious, intentional, and also recognising there are painful emotions we're going through just now, and we do need to find ways to process them.
Do you know, Claire,
sorry,
just on that, I really love how you've said there about doing this with our class. We've said less is more, and then we're asking people to journal, so that's immediately you think, oh, it's something else to do. But if we prioritise it and do it with our children, we're not only doing it ourselves at the same time, so we're making it real for everybody, but we're also teaching our children to prioritise their own health and well-being, and that's so lovely.
Well, it's part of our recovery curriculum, as I understand. In every single school, there's a recovery curriculum. So doing it together is great. And I think there are lots of health and well-being groups that are coming up in different schools now. Staff health and well-being groups. I'm seeing this popping up right across our schools, right across the country. What if this was the focus for the staff health and well-being group? What I'm offering today isn't necessarily the way to do it. I'm offering a way to get people thinking about what would be the best way to do it in our place, so that people start to become much more conscious about the thoughts, emotions, and the resulting behaviours are just not resourceful for us just now. And we need to think about how we can be resourceful in the best way possible moving forward. We are going to feel a lot more emotions as we go through this year. This isn't going to the corona coaster, as somebody said to me a few months ago, the corona coaster isn't going to stop anytime soon, and I'm so sorry to say this. And I read a book hundreds of years ago called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, Susan Jeffers. Great book, classic. But I've just put feeling the emotions and doing it anyway. Jennifer Nia sums it up beautifully. Teachers are emotionally committed to many different aspects of their job, and it's not an indulgence, it's actually a professional necessity. But without feeling and without the freedom to face themselves, to be whole persons in the classroom, they will implode, explode, or walk away. I've certainly had my implosions as an educator and my explosions, and I've had to walk away at times as well. So thinking about, what space, if those health and wellbeing groups are there, what space can we create? If leaders are listening to this today, what space can we create that is meaningful, not operational, but meaningful, about the need to express our emotions? Speaking our truth safely is something I've touched upon even, my word, goodness me. And also this idea that sometimes when it feels so bad and we feel that things are breaking down, it can just be the moment before we break through. Back to Barry and his personal training, who knew? And also, this too shall pass, just what you said earlier, Sharon. And laughing a little goes a long way to living a lot. So just if I can leave you with Barry and his personal training ways, it's good to have a little giggle now and again wherever we possibly can. So that's all I have to offer today. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm really happy as well to answer any questions on the back of this. And as I say, to be contacted at any time in the future for half an hour free chat, just to talk to me about what's going on for you when it all gets too much.
Claire, thank you very, very much indeed. as always, wise words from you based on research, which makes it even more important and powerful. There are various questions that I think we've answered in a roundabout way, either through the presentation or the support about how we get our schools and our employers to see what we need. There are other comments from people about their own personal situations, which are really quite challenging and difficult, and I think that's I'll pass them on to you, but as you've said, they have your number if they should need you, which is really helpful. I'm going to pass on to Fraser, but thank you once again, Claire.
Well, thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Sharon, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have any other questions, please contact communications@gtcs.org.uk. That's communications@gtcs.org.uk. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. As I mentioned previously, the materials from today's webinar will be available on our website through the Health and Wellbeing Hub as soon as possible. You will also receive a follow-up email soon with details of our October Wellbeing webinar. On behalf of GTC Scotland, Claire, Sharon and myself, thank you for joining us today and enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Good night.